Welcome to the CUNY Forum, a MetroView special. I'm Professor Ed Rogowsky, Director of the CUNY Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. The CUNY Forum is a monthly meeting of the students and faculty of the CUNY Internship Program coming together to talk about important issues about New York City with a panel of prominent New Yorkers. Tonight's topic, urban development, community, or economy. Let me introduce our panelists to you. Professor Ron Schiffman is director of the Pratt Institute Center for Community and Environmental Development. Jonathan Bowles is research director at the Center for an Urban Future. Majora Carter is project director at the Point Community Development Corporation in the South Bronx. And Adam Friedman is director of the New York Industrial Retention Network. Let me pose a question or problem and see what kind of response we evoke. Several decades ago, it seemed that efforts in New York City about urban redevelopment, about rehabilitating parts of New York, was about rebuilding neighborhoods. We had a significant citywide community development coalition, and we were about trying to bring new life to neighborhoods that had suffered decline. Now, some 20 to 30 years later, it seems that most of our redevelopment attention is about big projects, building large retail, commercial, office centers that create, we hope, hundreds and thousands of jobs and thereby help to rebuild New York. A difference that the late Bobby Wagner Jr., when he was a deputy mayor in the Koch administration, wrote about in a report called New York Ascendant, the difference between New York as a world city and New York as a city of neighborhoods. Ron Schiffman, you were an integral part of that community development movement in New York and one of its leaders. Have we undergone a transition, and if so, what's it about, do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure we really went through a transition. I think we've gone back in a swinging pendulum to where we were in the 60s when we were looking at these large and grandiose projects to try to solve our problems. When we envisioned community development and working with people on the neighborhood level, we envisioned it as not only rebuilding the housing stock of a community and repopulating areas that had been devastated through abandonment, but also seeing how one rebuilds a sense of community through both the creation of jobs, through a healthy environment, through creating a quality of life in those areas by providing people with opportunities. So we never really separated out the need between housing and rebuilding the economy. What we did, and where the big argument was, is that we felt the focus should be on community, that the focus should be on issues of social and equitable justice, and that the benefits of the development should accrue to the people who lived in these communities, and that we really needed to grow the economy from the base up rather than try to import an economy from other places. And that's the difference we had with Wagner and the global economy. Not that we shouldn't be part of it, but that we really should take advantage of it by building on our asset base, which really is the people of the city.
Mm-hmm. Majora, your experience has been working with a community development corporation, a neighborhood-based group in the South Bronx, one of those neighborhoods that was certainly the focus of interest and attention in the 60s and 70s as the result of abandonment and devastation. What's your experience like? What is the Point as an organization?
The Point is in of itself a neighborhood organization. They're dedicated to the cultural and environmental and economic revitalization of the Hunts Point community of the South Bronx. And as Ron was saying, when the Point was conceived of about 8 years ago at this point, it was building on the assets, of the community, which was the people that lived there, those who had survived the fires of, the 70s, those who had stuck it out, those who were actually moving back into the neighborhood, those who were basically, we're part of the poorest congressional district, in the country. And so there really weren't a lot of options available to the folks who had to live there. My family was one of those families. So I definitely, it's definitely coming from a place that I totally understand. So the assets were the people themselves, the arts, the culture, that was used to create what is now known as the Point. But what eventually I think was a real turning point for us as an organization was understanding that we really had to take a more holistic approach to the redevelopment of our communities, the way that Ron was thinking, about how the transformation of a community is going to be really focused on the going from the community out. We had to do that with ourselves and looking at the environment that was around us, how it had been really used against us, in terms of zoning and the fact that lots of industries such as waste transfer stations were located to our community, which really had a very negative effect on the people that live there, on our economy, on what was considered, the South Bronx economy, how it was developed, what was considered reasonable development in our neighborhoods. And we really had to sort of take the planning process that had been happening without us, without our consent, without our participation, and start thinking of ourselves more as planners. And that's what we're doing right now, which is basically thinking about our community, how it can develop, how it can grow, how it can prosper, and that includes us as part of a larger global picture, in being a part of New York City, as opposed to the place where you put things that you don't want to deal with.
That other neighborhoods don't want, but that other neighborhoods may have more power in keeping out. Jonathan, your organization, the Center for an Urban Future, studies lots of problems in New York, particularly about economic development. Your latest article in City Limits magazine is about the city's tax incentive program and what its impact has been. One of the major goals of recent mayoral administrations has been to create and or to retain jobs in New York City. Jobs held by people whether or not we know whether they're New York City residents or New York metropolitan area residents often, but large corporations come to city government and say, if we don't get tax incentives, we're going to move. We're going to move from Manhattan to New Jersey. And New York City finds itself competing with the state of New Jersey for offering up incentives, that is tax breaks in various forms, job credits against taxes, energy at lower costs, forgiving other kinds of taxes. New York has to compete against the entire state of New Jersey, a much larger jurisdiction with great sovereign power in the American system. And yet, you're telling us that the city runs this program and doesn't even publish the box score. We don't know how many jobs we've retained from the investments we've made, and very often we make deals that are not honored even as soon as a few years later. What's that problem about?
Sometimes as soon as a few months later. Whenever the city announces these big so-called corporate retention deals, there's a lot of fanfare. Often there's a press conference. At the very least, there's a big article in the New York Times, the New York Post, or one of the daily newspapers here that promotes what the city of New York is doing, saying that their active involvement in this, the giving away several $1 million, is going to retain or create X number of jobs, usually several hundred, sometimes several thousand. But no one ever looks what happens a few weeks or even a few months or a few years after those deals are announced. And we went and we tried to look at what exactly happened to those companies.
And what did you find?
Well, in the past 12 years, there have been about 80 companies, major corporations, that have received these corporate retention deals. Everyone from Citibank to Star Media Networks. And of those 80 companies, about 39 of them have laid off significant amounts of workers or entered into large-scale mergers within a few months or a few years after those deals closed. So I can't tell exactly how many of those companies are in default of the agreements, how many of those companies haven't done exactly what they said they were going to do as far as creating a certain number of jobs. But by all indications, about half of those deals have gone sour and probably haven't done what they were supposed to do.
So a large investment over these 12 years by the City of New York has been in the negative column, in effect. We haven't benefited. The entire city's economy hasn't benefited. The theory or the philosophical justification for these kinds of programs, I guess, has to do with, on the one hand, the reality that the city is in competition with other parts of this region, just as this whole region is in competition with other regions of the nation, and that we have to make these investments in order to hold on to what we have or to attract new companies, and that if we enhance the economy in general, what benefits will trickle down to the rest of us? Is that it?
I think that's the case they make. I mean, certainly city officials aren't in an easy position here. I mean, New Jersey has been successful with a lot of incentives of their own in attracting companies from New York City. I think that's why mayors in New York City for the past 12 to 16 years have really stepped up these tax incentive deals, is because a lot of companies did begin to leave New York City. And New York City, particularly in the early 1990s, was really hurting. There was a recession. We had already lost a lot of companies. Many more were considering moving to New Jersey, and there wasn't much that city officials at that time knew how to do. And the only thing that they then thought of, and the only thing that they've really done since to really hold on to these big companies, is to offer millions of dollars as kind of, to answer the corporate blackmail. There's no other approach. As I look at this and talk to people about this issue, I think, well, maybe at the very beginning there was no alternative for city officials, but as it got going 10, 12 years after the fact, you got to wonder why there wasn't an alternative long-term approach. There was obviously some certain very real issues why it was, why the cost of doing business in New York was high, or what things that New York City could do to retain these companies short of bribing them to stay here. But none of that was really ever attempted, and the only strategy was to give away millions of dollars, and by giving away all of this money to companies in the banking, financial services, and media industries, given what's happened in the last 6 to 10 years with all the mergers and consolidations, and now with the dot-coms, a lot of the burst of the dot-com bubble, it's not surprising that there's been layoffs. I mean, the city is almost getting what it paid for.
Well, I think we want to ask a question about what we know in terms of practices elsewhere in the country, but we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to ask Adam about the Industrial Retention Network, because retention, again, is the key or the operative phrase. To retain industrial jobs, therefore, to have the jobs, you have to retain the industries, the companies engaged in them. What's that thrust all about, Adam? What does the network do?
We're an organization that's really a membership in some way. We have a number of participants all around the city, 150 organizations, local development groups, groups like Majora's at the Point, that act as an early warning network to identify companies that are at risk, and then to use the resources of this network to develop strategies to keep those companies and remediate whatever issues are confronting them, whether it's relocation, space, financing, training.
I know one of the issues you've been involved with in recent years has been the printing industry and the problem of the concentration of those companies in certain parts of Manhattan, the desirability of that land in Manhattan for other uses, where buildings are owned by one set of folk and companies are tenants not owning their own buildings, the pressure to gentrify, as it were, in many cases to convert former manufacturing areas into residential areas and to make more money from that as a result. What alternatives have you worked on, for example, in the printing industry? How can we understand the process?
Well, I think just your statement of the problem really gets back to your opening question about the dichotomy between community and economic development. And it's a false dichotomy, but it's an accurate description of the city's strategy towards economic growth. And we've invested very heavily in making Manhattan. If we'd had more of a strategy that looked comprehensively at the city as a whole, that sought to encourage development in other downtowns in Long Island City or in downtown Brooklyn or in the Bronx, and that focused on investing in the infrastructure so that the city functioned as a whole, there wouldn't have been this tremendous pressure for everyone to be at the center and everyone to be in Manhattan. And I think sort of the problems you're describing about gentrification and sort of the turnover of our communities may have been less if the investment had been more equitably distributed throughout the city. In terms of our efforts in the printing industry, I mean, the challenge is really tremendous because we're starting at the point where there's this incredibly heavy concentration of one industry. The printing industry employs about 30,000 people in New York City, and it's very heavily concentrated in the Hudson Varick Street area. And there's one...
The West Side, Lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan area, and there's one very large property owner in that area that's now in the process of converting their space from manufacturing to office use. And the printing industry is composed of many, many small companies, each with many specialized functions, and it's very organic. You know, the industry is kind of a community, and you know, the people who do commercial lithography need to be near the binders, need to be near the printing ink suppliers, near the painting suppliers. So the challenge is to really think about how to relocate a community. And we've tried to identify other large areas that would be appropriate and then provide them the technology assistance to move, because it's a very costly process, and move them together so that if one or two companies goes, the whole cluster goes. And that way they sort of maintain the competitive advantages that they had operating in Lower Manhattan.
And that's one of the keys, is if the location of an industry sector within New York is going to shift from one part of Manhattan to another, or out of Manhattan to one of the other boroughs, you really want to get a few of them to move at the same time so that no one feels they're the pioneer, they're going in isolation, they're not connected to companies that do related things in their industry.
That's right.
Has it worked at all? Has there been success in this regard?
There's about 40-odd companies that we know of that are in the process of relocating. Half of them are moving to Long Island City. There's clearly another cluster which has emerged there. But it's a very difficult process. We don't, in part because this is all small business, and it gets to the dichotomy you were asking Jonathan about, and how we focus on the large deals. And here we're trying to provide services to a very large number of small businesses, and the city doesn't operate that way.
And it's not nearly as sexy when you make those kinds of announcements
Right.
of several small businesses. They're not one big major corporate client or tenant, as it were. Ron?
I remember traveling back with Adam from visiting a couple of the printers in one of the Trinity-owned buildings in Lower Manhattan, and we pulled out a back of the envelope and did some calculations, and I can't remember the figures, but the cost of the city buying out the development rights from the property owner to keep the manufacturers there would have been small compared with the total cost now of relocating this community to another part of the city.
Would you explain the concept of development rights and buying them out by government?
Basically, the buildings are privately owned. They're owned in this case by a not-for-profit entity, but they are very much driven by the revenues they can. It's a for-profit company belonging to a church-based group, but they're driven by the desire to make as much money as they want. Well, we can't take that away. This is the United States, and we have a market-driven economy. But if the city invested and bought from them those buildings, or at least bought the right to take those buildings beyond what they're being used for,
That is,
to another.
as a manufacturing building, they're worth X amount of dollars.
And
If
as
they
a
were to be-
residential, they're worth X plus Y.
Or as a
and so they get a
office
subsidy
building, right.
of Y. Or you buy that right from them, so they stay
you buy
as
the
a
difference in value.
By the difference in value, that would have been far cheaper than the cost of these companies being forced to move out, and the impact, the social and economic impact on the families and others that are employed there. You started out by talking about the redevelopment and rebuilding of communities. And one of the things I have to remind people about is that the reason we wound up with abandoned and vacant housing in our neighborhoods is because manufacturing, for a variety of factors, left New York City in large numbers. And when we saw a few 100,000 jobs moving out, we saw the economy collapsing in many of the neighborhoods, and therefore the real estate collapsed.
That is, the folks who had these jobs and their families couldn't afford to live where they lived anymore, and had to, in effect, be driven from their housing. They were, in effect, driven by their inability to afford. We also, we know at certain points, certainly in the 60s, had some criminal activity by those who owned buildings to try and drive residents out for their insurance, for the insurance value on many of these buildings that were later torched. Part of the pattern of abandonment that we seem at least to have arrested early enough to avoid it happening in many other neighborhoods since. Jonathan, in your work looking at the tax incentive issue, and you talked before about the way a company comes to the city and says, give me a deal or I'm going. It sounds like a game of bluff poker. Is that what it comes down to ultimately?
What's the city going to do? There's really no way of verifying that a company isn't really going to go. It could do its research. It could call Jersey City, it can call Hoboken and then the other places in New Jersey and Connecticut and really try to determine whether it's really serious about doing that. Newspaper reporters have done some of that. But short of that, it's really held hostage. And by starting the ball rolling, it kind of like is like dominoes falling. That once you enter into one of these deals, there's no stopping it, because every competitor of one of the companies that gets these deals comes to the city's door and says, I want my piece of the share.
You've put me at a competitive
my piece of the
disadvantage
pie.
because my competitor now can do business cheaper than I can here in the city because you've given them tax breaks.
There's several companies that have gotten tax breaks that said, that acknowledged they had no real threat of moving out of the city. They just wanted to get their share of the pie.
Well,
Can I
go
just
ahead.
jump in? I used to sit on the board that made the decisions with regard to many of these tax breaks on the ICIP, which is a program that subsidizes the development of commercial space. And at that point in time, it was providing subsidies for office development in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. And let me just tell you the pressure that you feel in whether or not you're going to turn down a company. It's very, very difficult if you have the CEO or the CFO sitting there testifying in a hearing that he is going to move out 500 jobs or 1,000 jobs unless he gets a certain abatement. It's a tremendous amount of political pressure, and it leads me to believe that the solution does not lie at home, that this is an issue that really requires that requires federal intervention. You know, it is New York competing against New Jersey, and the feds need to step in here.
But there are other things we can do. I mean, there are other reasons that companies leave New York, and that deal with everything from crime to the quality of life to the ability of employees to find a decent and affordable housing. And if we focused our effort and made those investments in the neighborhoods, then we would have much more of an ability to retain those industries and offices than we now have. And I would think that we really need to rethink this fundamentally. There's nothing wrong with groups moving out, with concerns moving out. What it really hurt New York City was the lack of births. A lot of what we're doing and I happen to be on Adam's board on the New York Industrial Retention Network, is not only looking at manufacturing retention, but using manufacturing retention as a platform for the growth of new manufacturing enterprises. And I think we have to do that the same way in the office sector and in the other commercial sectors, is really look at how do we seed those new enterprises rather than retain the old. And that's what New York always was. It was a place to birth these businesses.
That is, if we lost some, we were growing new ones.
So it didn't matter.
And for places or communities like the South Bronx, where there definitely is there's definitely a tension. There's news that the Fulton Fish Market is moving in. A lot of community residents are not really happy about this for a myriad of reasons.
They don't like fish?
It's not the fish part that we're worried about. It's everything else. Here we have one of the we have more truck traffic, in this community. We see about 20,000 truck trips a week. The asthma rates in our community are going through the roof right now. And even when you talk to the businesses, which we do on a regular basis, they're concerned, about the fact that it's difficult for them to get their trucks in and out of the community. And we're really concerned. We're thinking this is a great deal for Lower Manhattan. They're getting a lot more land that they can develop in a really expensive, fancy little manner. And our waterfront is being used in a way that, the Fulton Fish Market is coming and we're being promised 150 jobs. What about the people who are working there right now? We know that most of them do not come from Hunts Point. And so for us, it's about finding, just as Ron was saying, finding, attracting new kind of businesses in a way that actually could be, sustainable, because our communities, many of our communities, were actually walk to work. Hunts Point was one of those neighborhoods where people would there were lots of light manufacturing there, and for various reasons, again, moved out. And now, we're stuck with either, empty spaces or, worse, being a haven for waste transfer stations. So we are really interested in finding the kind of developments that actually will bring a level that will increase the quality of life that we actually have in our community.
The point in our program where we want to turn to our audience and invite questions from students. We'll come back for more discussion. But let's hear our first question. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Sukhbir Singh, and I am at City College, City of CUNY. And my question is to Mr. Jonathan Bowles. Earlier he was speaking about that the big companies have received tax incentives from the city and sweet deals. How did you arrive at that? Where do you look for, if you have to do the research, where do you look for for this information. And how do you arrive at that?
Well,
what you said.
the city doesn't make it easy for you, but over time, the city's Economic Development Corporation has entered into all of these deals. I said about 80 or so, and there are various filings, disclosures that they have to make. For example, the Industrial Development Agency is a board run by the city that actually approves these deals. There's an administrative setup where they have to vote and approve it. It's pro forma, those things happen. There's never any real discussion about those things. But there is somewhat of a paper trail because, there are, documents to go to every board member for the IDA deals. And so those are things you can get, and to actually find out whether that the companies have fulfilled their obligations, whether they've actually done anything, that's a lot more difficult because the city doesn't require them to actually file or at least release the public information about how much employment each company has in the years after getting those tax incentives. So what I did was actually just do an exhaustive research search on the web, on Nexus, looking at old newspaper clippings and magazine articles and also corporate press releases. In as many cases as I could, I tried talking to the actual companies and asking their human resources departments. But it wasn't easy, and I think that I found that about half of the companies ended up laying off workers, but it could be more.
Mm-hmm. Not easy to get the data to try and even analyze what the patterns have been.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Our next question, yes, tell us your name and your campus.
Yes, my name is Serena Springle. I'm from CUNY, City College, CWE campus. My question is again to Jonathan Bowles. You talked about that you found out that a lot, you weren't able to tell through mergers that companies weren't utilizing the money from the tax plan. And what I'd like to know is there a mechanism in place now to do some type of tracking so that you can see not only how New Yorkers are benefiting, but how the money is being utilized?
No, there really isn't. I think that it's a shame the city council, not only the public, the city council isn't even given the employment information about these companies in the years after getting these deals. The city council also doesn't hold public hearings. Let's say that the city wants to give a corporation $60 million as part of one of these retention deals. The city council doesn't ever hold public hearings. Whether they have that power, I'm not really sure, but they certainly don't use it, and it's really not incorporated into the city's governing structure. There needs to be a whole new series of mechanisms, like you say, and I think the one to start with is at least to put some kind of a follow-up guide, some kind of an annual report, so that the public can find out if these things are even working. If they are, I think it would only show some confidence in the city's programs. Public money's being expended, and if we're getting something, if we're actually getting jobs for it, then maybe there wouldn't be this frustration with these programs.
There actually is a local law that requires EDC, the Economic Development Corporation, which administers a lot of this, to make an annual report, Local Law 69. And I remember 5 years ago they just announced they weren't going to comply any longer.
Well, there is a Local Law 69 report, but I find it completely unhelpful and unuseful. It lists the actual companies that have gotten the incentives, and it usually lists the amount of money that each company has gotten, but there's no follow-up, there's no year-to-year update on what the companies are doing, and it's really not useful at all.
So it would list the decisions made and the value of the tax breaks. That is, we don't actually give the company money. We forgive them future taxes or credits against their taxes, but we're not handing out cash. We're just saying that these are the category of government activity called tax expenditures. We're spending taxes we're not going to collect. So we're going to reduce the money we take in. But if all it does is list the company and the amount of the value of that in 1 year and not track it forward, then you don't really have a way of measuring.
It does one other thing, and it actually projects anticipated future revenue and future jobs for the city. Of course, that is highly inflated and overly optimistic, and it almost never ends up happening. At least we don't know if it ends up happening. So in every case, it really tries to justify what the city is doing.
And here's a city program that's based on the need to compete, especially within the region. And again, New York City versus the sovereign state of New Jersey, and we don't get very much help from New York State government in this regard in terms of the competition between states, which you could understand perhaps more easily in a federal system which is based on separate states, each of which has sovereignty. So New York New York City is at a competitive disadvantage because it doesn't even have the kind of governmental power that a state has, and certainly not as deep a set of pockets as the state of New Jersey would have. As you've looked at this, are there particular reforms that you would recommend, ways to deal with this that would give the public more information in the future?
There are, and I just want to first say, though, that I think the frustration that so many people feel about these programs from every community in the city, from every business, I mean, 99% of the businesses in New York City are small businesses with under 500 employees. You know, New York isn't an easy place to do business, but the small businesses, whenever I go and talk to small businesses everywhere in the city, all they see is these big tax deals. They also see the major economic development projects happening in the boroughs outside of Manhattan are baseball stadiums. The Giuliani administration, if you look at the legacy for economic development, it's basically a stadium in every borough. But there's probably a dozen or two really small things that would really benefit companies. So when you look at actual reforms of this, I think an annual update of whether we're getting the benefit from these programs is somewhere to start. But I think that Adam touched on earlier the idea of investing in infrastructure and also really focusing on a 5-borough approach to economic development and even a community approach to economic development. None of that is done right now, and like I said, the only real attempt to do anything outside of New York is really the big baseball stadium type deals. There really needs to be an attempt to really look at what is good, what are the needs of every individual sector that is important to New York City's economy, and also looking at the neighborhood level, what is important for neighborhood development. Okay.
Yes, tell us your name and your campus and direct your question.
My name is Cheryl Klein. I'm a senior at York College, and my question is, it's not for anyone in particular. Anyone can answer. I just wanted an observation. Some of our policies in New York are kind of ambiguous when we look at them in terms of we encourage corporate development, but at the same time, we're discouraging in some areas local community development. And what we, in terms of developing economic development in local areas, that stimulates the economy as well. So what would anyone project that we do in developing our local economy so that in terms there's growth, not just in the city, but all across New York?
Let me put it to Majora first, because the issue of corporate development versus community development, is that the sense at the neighborhood level in your area in the South Bronx?
Yes, absolutely. It's a good question. There's a sense in not just the South Bronx, but in the poorer communities of color, in many cases, that development occurs without their participation or knowledge, or we find out about things after projects are already put in place. And so I really, truly believe that in order for New York City, our community, even from the citywide down to the neighborhood level, to really develop in a way that's actually going to be useful to all New Yorkers, is that if we actually start doing it in a really systematic and more holistic way, we've got to have community participation in any of these projects that are going on around the city, be they, for municipal services, be they, power plant issues, asking questions like, what is good for New York City as opposed to what is good for Manhattan. I think is a really important question that we need to ask. What's good on a neighborhood level? How is it affecting, the health and the educational aspects for the folks that live in communities that are poor, usually not white. And these are questions that most people really, I think outside of this group and the groups that we frequent, are not the kind of questions that really want to be answered. But we have to start thinking about them in terms of the growth and development of the city, because we are really the smallest part of the city is the neighborhood level, and then we have to work out it from that direction.
Adam, I wanted to ask you, The printing industry is one example that we talked about of the effort to retain and to move from one part of the city to another. Are there any other industries in particular that you've had experience with in recent years that are critical, where some of this is happening, and what might we be looking forward to?
Let me offer a different strategy to what's characterized the city. I think what we've been describing is kind of deal making. And of course, it's the largest business entities do best in that situation because they're the ones that are able to navigate the city bureaucracy. And Jonathan from the Center for an Urban Future and myself and Ron Majora, I think, have been advocating, one, that the most important economic development services are delivered by the Board of Ed, they're delivered by the police department, and by DOT. You know, it's basic
Traffic,
municipal
housing,
services.
education.
And that's important for every community. And then second, above that, is the sectoral approach with which Jonathan began to describe. We have an initiative in the food industry. The food industry employs something like 15,000 people in New York City. And what we're trying to do is develop new institutions and networks that move away from deal making for large entities where many small companies can participate. And by building organizations within these different sectors, you can deliver services to a large number of small businesses. And one example that sort of illustrates how community and economic development should be linked together, nationally, consumer demand for specialty food, particularly ethnic food, is growing. It's projected to become a $75 billion industry. New York City is a great big test kitchen, right? You have all the small...
Everybody in New York likes to eat.
Everyone likes to eat. It's an incredibly diverse population, right?
And we're great cooks.
Right.
Yes.
And we're witness to that comparable girth.
Speak for yourself.
We're an
Not
incredibly
Majora.
diverse... Right. Went to the gym? Okay.
Yes.
We're an
right.
incredibly diverse population. And, you know, entrepreneurs get started making food products that serve their local market. And an economic development policy that integrates community and economic development would be to work with those entrepreneurs and help them cross over to serving a regional or a national market. And so we're trying to do that as a model of a sectoral initiative.
Just recently, with regard to the food industry, the New York Times city section on Sunday carried the story about the tortilla triangle in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. 3 companies that got started by New Yorkers to serve a market for the breads that go with their food, but they have all grown and are at that stage where they could benefit from what the network is offering. Have you been working with them at all?
We've worked with one of them. We hope to be going back to them to launch a new marketing assistance program that can help them make that jump from serving basically local markets to serving regional markets.
Yeah, but we're going to encounter a real difficulty for them and other enterprises like them if we don't provide the real estate and the facilities in which they can start producing, because a lot of the areas that were available to them and the buildings that were available are now being priced out. So the next wave of people leaving the city of New York are going to be the producers, the people who make something that you can hold, because they can't find a place in which to do that any longer in the city of New York.
We have another question. Tell us your name and your campus and put your question, please.
Hi, my name is Roger Rossetti. I'm from John Jay College. My question is for Mr. Friedman. You had a comment before about federal government that they should come in and assist. Now, by what I have understood through the empowerment zones, this is one of the ways that the federal government has helped out. Do you think that has helped grow or take away from the smaller companies, because the federal help usually comes in for larger companies that...
What I was suggesting before is that the federal government come in to sort of prevent the competition and the giveaways and the sort of corporate blackmail that we're now seeing, the war between the states and giving away tax abatements. With regard to the empowerment zone, I haven't been a great fan of the empowerment zones. Basically what you're doing is moving one entity, one business to another neighborhood, and I don't know that there's a great gain. And maybe it would have made better sense to upgrade, provide training, upgrade the infrastructure in that community, to encourage or facilitate entrepreneurs getting, on the first rung, which is what Ron was describing.
Ron, in that community development perspective, do you think empowerment zones have been an effective tool for real growth, or is it the kind of checkerboard moving things around that Adam
Well, I
describes?
tend to agree with Adam. I think that what they do is they're actually set up competitive areas within the same geographic or the same municipality to move what would have developed into another place. It's another way of sort of bribing the larger corporations to come there. Had the empowerment zone focused on birthing new enterprises, that would have been a different story. Had they gone in and really looked at what are the creative assets that exist in the community, what is there that needs the resources, and what do they need to overcome the burdens of launching new enterprises, that would be a different story. They really haven't. Just getting a Home Depot to move into a neighborhood or a larger corporation to come in to a commercial strip isn't going to do it. To help that local entrepreneur get a new retail shop going or a new tortilla business going or a new enterprise going, and that's a different story. And I think that's where we should focus our efforts at, is really looking at how we sort of create a more fertile environment for new births to come forth.
Jonathan, there have been another number of other reports from the Center for an Urban Future, not just on the tax incentive issue and what's happened with to the grantees and the benefit to the city. You've looked at other industry sectors. Are there any particular ones that we should take note of, places where the city has an opportunity that it's missing, where it could do better?
Well, I think that the interesting thing is that so many different sectors that we've looked at keep saying that real estate, as Ron mentioned, is the #1 concern right now.
Room for them to grow in, places they can afford. That's what we mean by the real estate concern.
Places where they can afford, but just anywhere where they can set up shop right now, whether it's food manufacturing, printing, or even biotechnology. Those diverse industries, there's just not enough space in New York right now. Senator Schumer set up a panel a few months ago to actually get to the bottom of that one question. Hopefully he'll be putting out a report sometime soon, but I think that it really speaks to the actual problem of economic development in this city, that our city leaders are too accustomed to looking at, from a deal perspective, like Adam said, that what can we give this company to get them to stay in New York? Whereas if they actually went to every industry, they would find that the tax costs that these tax incentives are trying to overcome aren't even the major problem right now. It's actually real estate, and there's 100 little things that they could probably be doing. One is through zoning protections for a lot of companies to be able to stay. That's certainly the case with a lot of the manufacturing companies. There's also should be incentives not for individual companies to stay in certain places, but in some cases there could be incentives for developers to build multi-tenant type facilities. So there's a number of solutions, but I think that the city really needs to start thinking outside of its normal box and really begin to look at really go to every sector.
Well, thinking outside the normal box is kind of a critical approach to lots of our urban problems these days, trying to get the agencies, the actors, the leaders in elective office to think differently about problems than we've been thinking. Certainly one of the thrusts in New York for several decades now has been to rezone, to take what land that was former manufacturing land and change its zoning category so that office space could be developed and residential could be developed, because those are profitable and immediate in terms of benefit to the owners of that land. Are you saying that we need to stop turning manufacturing land into commercial and residential areas?
Well, funny you asked that. Tomorrow, a number of us are meeting to go over a draft report that the Pratt Center is working with the Municipal Art Society, with the Center for Urban Futures, with NIRN, with the New York Environmental Justice Alliance, looking at zoning in New York. And we are finding that there is very little space for manufacturing to expand, that they are being displaced, that there are areas that need to be rezoned because, in fact, they have already converted from manufacturing to residential. But that a lot of our manufacturing land needs to be retained. But we have to go a lot further. We have to look at our zoning programs and land use decisions in concert with our finance and investment decisions. And we also have to look at it in concert with the policies of the city of New York and begin to look at how our policies have been destroying both communities and our economy. The garbage wars which have been fought in the city of New York, the city closing, the landfill on Staten Island, have set up all these waste transfer stations that have inundated communities like Hunts Point, like Greenpoint, like Williamsburg, and Red Hook, and have gone into a lot of our former manufacturing areas, consuming areas that at one time produced things, now are just holding and shipping garbage. Without looking at what are really the sustainable strategies for us to reduce our waste stream, what are the ways that we could really look at the future in terms of reducing our energy demands so that we have a healthier environment in the city of New York, and at the same time production. And when you look at these things, they lead to the next industrial revolution for the city of New York. They provide us with the opportunity not to use landfills to discard our old monitors, but to start using factories to remanufacture those products into new usable products. Corporations are beginning to look that way. The city has to start thinking about this and see what are the locational and competitive advantages for New York so that we could take advantage of this by really investing in this.
And yet earlier you talked about the nature of the American economy and the American constitutional ethic. This is a system driven by market forces, our great god of capitalism and the reverence for private property, precepts which we're not going to change, certainly. Can the things that you talk about become economically profitable? Are they viable? Two of the words these days that we're used to hearing in discussions about development and redevelopment are the notion of dealing with the brownfields, the land that's been contaminated from some previous use, in many cases because of manufacturing and manufacturing-related uses. And yet we're talking about the need for new manufacturing space. How do we protect in the future from creating new brownfields, let alone how do we reclaim the brownfields land for use now for some of those manufacturing expansions we need, or for other purposes? We can't find places to put schools, for example.
When we were talking in the past about this sort of green manufacturing, we always thought about green products but never thought about green processes of manufacturing. The industries have been going through dramatic changes. Businesses for social responsibility, which I think are made up of 1,400 major corporations in the United States, have all started to adhere to a set of principles where they're going to clean up their manufacturing processes. So you've got large corporations like Cisco Systems and Sony and Interface, which makes floor carpeting, and dozens of other corporations that are beginning to say they're going to reduce their reliance on natural resources and move to what are called zero-end waste production. In other words, they will no longer be producing waste. They'll be using clean processes for doing them. They're meeting on voluntary standards far exceeding our national requirements because they understand the adverse effects of global warming and the immediacy of those issues. We tend to think of this as being something outside our city boundaries. The New York Times and Bob Herbert and others are now writing articles about global warming, and they talk about it in terms of international compacts. They never look at local policies that are contributing to it. When Majora talks about asthma in the Bronx, she's talking about the same phenomena that's leading to global warming, killing and leading to the highest level of infant mortality and death rates in some of the urban areas that you're finding because of the same kind of diseases that are affecting our population. We need to start planning and investing in ways that we will attract these industries. The private sector is far ahead of local government and our national government in looking at these kinds of
And yet government,
processes.
whether it's at the local or the national level, seems, if that's the reality you're describing, often seems unwilling to challenge the private sector for fear that somehow we'll drive them away, will therefore reduce the number of jobs and contribute to the ill health of the economy. And you're suggesting that that's not the thinking in the private sector.
I think what we do is, in New York in particular, is we think of the private sector as being the large-scale real estate developers. Well, I like Chuck Schumer, but Chuck is more concerned with the real estate board of New York than he is with the manufacturers, with the printing industry, and with the labor unions right now. And he's got to bring them into the fold and start thinking about how they relate and how the communities relate to what his economic development strategy is.
And I was suggesting that brownfields is one of the two new words that we're using. The other is sustainable development. And I know that's an issue that you're concerned about. When we talk about sustainable development, what do we mean?
I mean, literally, it means how do you create an environment, an economy, a quality of life in the present, in the here and now, that's useful, sustainable to us today, and that it's not going to degrade the future quality of life for our children and our other descendants.
So that we don't use up natural resources, we don't pollute, we don't create garbage, we have no way to dispose of.
So it's just really working on dealing with, like waste management, in New York City was just about where do we put our garbage, as opposed to like seriously managing, the waste on both, citywide as well on a personal level. I mean, education was not really thought of. It's like, people, New Yorkers don't recycle. We can't possibly expect them to do so. That was the mentality of a lot of it, unfortunately, city agencies. Same thing with the power situation. Oh my God, we have to build 12,000 new power plants immediately. Otherwise, by July 1st, everybody's going to be in darkness. First of all, it's not true. Secondly, we really could be thinking about conservation and also creating the kind of developments within our communities. And those are developments. How we manage, municipal services is something that could be considered a development for our, for the community, and I mean New York City community. And making sure that, we do understand that it is not just about us today. And there is a tomorrow, and it hopefully will come, it'll be wonderful and beautiful for lots of people, but we have to start thinking about that
Part
now.
of that sustainability then is a consciousness and a conscience both about the future, about the impact of what we do.
Absolutely.
With the few minutes that are remaining, I want to ask each of you just to talk about the future. If there were a few things that you'd put on the agenda for the new city government that's to be elected this fall, that will take office in January of next year, what would those few policy initiatives be? What difference might they make? Ron, let me ask you to leave that over if you would.
Since we've been talking about sustainable development, I would focus on a sustainable development strategy that builds up from the community. And just to add one comment to what I said before in your question, the business community is beginning to recognize that garbage at the end and waste is actually lost profits. That if they can consume everything they buy, then they have more profit to make. And I think there's been a lot written and a lot thought about how we do these things and begin to function. I would hope that New York begins to look at its zoning laws, its program and land use policies in a coordinated way, in a systemic way, and begins to see how we build and rebuild the city, not quantitatively, which is what's been driving us, but qualitatively, and do that in such a way that we benefit those at the base rather than just those to help a limited number accumulate more and more wealth.
Jonathan?
I'd say two things. One, in the immediate, something that could be done right away, is the Brooklyn Army Terminal. We talk about all the money that's been given away, the $2 billion or so in tax incentives to large corporations, but in the 80s, the Koch administration pumped in a couple of dozen millions of dollars to really rehab an old Army terminal for small businesses. Today, that facility is 99% full, mostly with small manufacturing businesses that are thriving. Dozens of companies are there. There's another building there right now that is empty because it needs the basic infrastructure development, putting in elevator, plumbing, that kind of thing, that I think if the city, instead of giving money to all the big corporations, decided to put this investment in the Army terminal, making it ripe for dozens of other small businesses. Given the real estate crisis we have right now, I think that's something that would be smart and could be done right away. Second, just one word, planning. So little of it gets done, and it's at the heart of community planning. It's at the heart of corporate planning. I mean, it's a way to really deal with these corporations. You have to plan for the future. You can't just give them something for the now and today.
Okay. Majora, in a minute.
Okay, follow up on the planning issue. Unfortunately, I don't think that enough is done in general, that's comprehensive and that is looking at the sustainability of all of it, and just paying attention to the comprehensive community plans that are coming, and implementing the sustainable ones so that we can actually have a sustainable future for the rest of the community.
Adam?
I would just add to Ron's sort of the principles for governance, equity. One of the things I think we've been describing here is the lack of equity in our economic development strategies and in our delivery of municipal services. And second, to recognize the strength that we have from our diversity, that we've sort of been focusing on this core area in Manhattan, a very limited number of industries. And when we should look at our diversity as a strength, and that if we want to be a global city, we have the greatest resources for that right here, and that's our diverse population.
On behalf of the students and faculty of the City University Internship Program, I want to thank Ron Schiffman, Jonathan Bowles, Majora Carter, and Adam Friedman for joining us for this discussion. I think it's been one of the richest and most informative that we've had here at the CUNY Forum. It tells us about our condition and how we need to think about ourselves and our future if it's going to be worthwhile for all of us in a sustainable fashion. Thank you for joining us at the CUNY Forum. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.